Well, good morning, everyone. And I know this is a little unusual for me to be doing my weekly roundup on Friday rather than earlier in the week, but it's been a hell of a week. Lots of legislative activity, and so I hope we can catch up on a number of issues. And I know I've been absent for a couple weeks here as well. First, let me start with a piece of good news. Tomorrow, after 320 days at sea, the aircraft carrier, the Ford, and Carrier Strike Group 12 is going to finally return to Hampton Roads. Our military is the best in the world. They have been extraordinarily professional, but this deployment of the Ford is the longest deployment in modern Navy history. And why? The carrier was in the Middle East, then it was over in Venezuela, then it was brought to the Middle East, back again on the Iran war. We've seen a fire break out on the Ford that eliminated a lot of the ability for literally the beds for the sailors. We saw plumbing problems. You don't put out a carrier and their strike group for this long a time when you plan for much shorter deployment. So I want to welcome the sailors back to their families. I do want to note this. I'm looking forward, after they've had a bit of time with their families, to sit down with those sailors and their families and hear how it was. What was the strain? The notion that they were deployed for a long time in the Middle East, waiting on the president to feel when it's in his bones to declare victory over Iran. That is not treating our military with the respect they deserve. And I'm going to be very curious to see how many of these professionals we lose because of the extended time on this deployment. So we want to welcome the Ford and the Carrier Group back. I look forward to visiting with the sailors and others and their families over the coming weeks to hear from them directly about this record-setting deployment. Let me stay on the topic of the military and move over to the VA, where it's crazy. Senator Kaine and I wrote a letter to the VA secretary. The VA secretary is arbitrarily cutting literally thousands of VA positions. We've heard, I think it's going to be 700 in Hampton. Let me just make sure I got my numbers right here. 1,700 across Virginia. 1,700 across Virginia, 700 at Hampton, 300 at Richmond, and 200 in Salem. So we're hitting all regions of the state. They have been totally non-transparent, and we don't even know how many of the elimination of these positions are taking place at the new facility in Spotsylvania or the other one in Chesapeake that we've literally spent years building. And I hear, particularly in the Spotsylvania case, where veterans are not getting able to get scheduled because they'd not been able to hire enough people. And I have one of my many multi-year efforts is trying to get the wait times down at the Hampton VA, and I've been back on a repeated basis. And many times the wait times were based upon the lack of providers. And what you've got so far from the VA is an indication that they're going to get rid of people who deal directly, whether it's technicians, doctors, x-ray technologists, people who manage pharmacy benefits. All this being done in an area like in Virginia, where we've got 630,000 veterans, and that number is growing. This is the kind of lack of transparency, lack of plan that has been run rampant through President Trump's second term, not just in the VA, but across a whole host of domains. So we expect to get answers. Our veterans deserve better. And I, again, tend to be sitting down with them and getting the answers on what was the mode of determining what positions are getting eliminated, and what is that going to do to level of care. A few years back, I was proud to be part of advancing and passing the PACT Act, which extended care, particularly to Vietnam veterans and Iraq Afghan veterans. To promise veterans that extended new care and then not have the personnel is a tragedy, and it is a total sign of disrespect to the men and women who keep our nation safe. I want to move from the veterans to the issue of, again, something I've been working on for a long time. A couple years back, we asked GAO to do an analysis of black lung disease, which is mostly takes place in the mining industry. We've got a lot of black lung cases down in Southwest Virginia. I remember just a few months ago being in Russell County and again hearing firsthand the heartbreaking stories of miners, not in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, but literally in their 20s and 30s getting black lung. And we have legislation that would increase the benefits. We've asked the GAO, and their study confirmed that these benefits don't go far enough, don't provide the level of care, and increasingly with the silica that these miners are exposed to, this becomes a death sentence, and a death sentence that literally in some cases takes years. And as black lung penetrates into younger and younger miners, this is not fair or right. And again, this comes from the president who said he was going to bring back mining and protect miners. He literally, his administration was the one that stopped some of the extensiveness of making sure that silica was actually covered. We now have the data that's showing these miners and their families are not being treated fairly. I'm going to continue to work on advancing my legislation to make sure these miners get the benefits they've earned and they've deserved. Last item, so we can get to the questions. Couldn't do this without commenting about the president's completely ill-advised plan of spending $1 billion on his vanity project in the ballroom. You got to wonder if Americans are scratching their heads when they see gas at $4.50 a gallon, and the president wants to take $1 billion of taxpayer money to build out his ballroom that was supposed to be paid for entirely with private donations. This is morally wrong. It is policy-wise wrong. And so I did a little bit of analysis, and what would $1 billion buy you here in Virginia? Well, it would take care of about 2/3 of the people who lost their health care out of the affordable tax credits. We could pay for those tax benefits, tax credits for 2/3 of the people who lost their health care for a full year. That would be extraordinarily significant. We could pay for, I believe, up to 5 years for folks who lost their SNAP benefits, food benefits, for the folks coming out of the president's big ugly bill. And last week, this week has also been Cops Week, where we celebrate our law enforcement. That $1 billion, then some of this is being said could be used for security and so forth. Well, that $1 billion could pay for 5 years of the COPS Act benefits that go to police departments all over the country to actually make sure law enforcement is equipped with the tools that they need to enforce the law. No, we didn't spend those public monies, or they've not asked to spend those public monies on cops or on health care or on food benefits. They want to spend it on the president's ballroom. It is morally wrong. It is policy-wise wrong. And I'm going to do everything I can to stop it in its tracks. So with that, I will turn it over to Catherine and be happy to take your questions.
Hi, folks. Before we get into questions, can everybody please ensure that your mics are muted? You're causing some pretty bad feedback on the call for all of the other participants. And with that, our first question is from Mitchell with WTOP.
Hold on. I'm getting way too much.
Hi, Senator. Before I get to my question, I just wanted to state on behalf of myself and I'm sure others on this call, I'd like to extend my sincere condolences on the death of your daughter, Madison. I'm sure she'll remain an inspiration to continue your work.
Thank you for that. I'm now part of a group that nobody wants to be part of, a club where a parent buries a daughter. And the only thing I'll say is that my daughter was a fighter, and in the last few years, she really came to appreciate my job and urged me always. She always say, "Dad, you got the power. Try to try to make things better. And whatever's left of my public service career, and I'm obviously in the midst of asking Virginia to hire me one last time, I'm going to stay true to that admonition. But if we could work on the feedback so I can make sure we're not cross-talking. But Mitchell, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator. I know you have mentioned her on these calls in the past, and we really appreciate it, and we're thinking about you. A question related to the war in the Strait of Hormuz. Some energy analysts are starting to sound the alarm that if the issue of the transit through the strait isn't resolved soon, oil inventories around the globe are going to start running out, and that could really shake up energy markets and potentially the financial markets. I wanted to get your thoughts on that and your concerns moving forward.
Well, first of all, we are on the precipice of an absolute energy crisis. And, you know, even if the strait opens tomorrow, we're talking months, if not years, before we bring back stability. And the oil markets, all of the reserves have run down. And what makes matters even worse is if there was a reopening of hostilities, you could then have, coming out of Yemen, the Houthis literally close the passage that goes up through the Suez Canal. There's another strait similar to the Strait of Hormuz, and you could shut down total oil supply from the Middle East. And that would affect, you know, you would not see, you would wish then for $4.50 gasoline. You could see $6, $7, $8, $9 a gasoline. You would see all of our costs across all consumer goods go up because 80% of the goods that go to our stores are delivered by trucks, and that runs on diesel fuel, when the prices are already at record highs. You'd see aluminum prices, which have already skyrocketed. And while America still would have some production, many of our partner countries around the world their economies would potentially crumble because they wouldn't have the fuel to operate. So this is what happens when you start a war of choice and you don't have a full plan. And the irony here is going to be, you know, as the president determines what's next, and he's not accomplished any of his goals. Obviously, the Iranian leadership is still horrible. There's not any plan on the enriched uranium. They still have plenty of missiles left, and the strait is closed. You could see him try to, you know, declare victory and move out and end up, the great irony would be, end up back with the similar arrangement that we had during the JCPOA, when there was at least some ability to observe Iran's nuclear capabilities, but we didn't, which got taken away when he ripped up that agreement. But I've heard rumors that, you know, they're talking about bringing that version back and calling a different name. So we'll see, but this crisis is already partially baked in. But as the reporting is correct, we go a few more, I'm not going to specify the period of time, but it's not months and months. We go a bit longer, and you're going to see these reserves run out, and you could have not only record high energy prices, but you could see a meltdown in the financial markets.
Our next question is from Emma with the Virginian Pilot.
Hey, Senator Warner. Thanks so much for your time today. I wanted to ask you a quick question about the VA vacancy cuts. We did some reporting on this last month, and one of the things that stood out to me the most from my read of the data was that the Hampton VA alone lost more vacancies than some entire VISNs. And I'm just curious if something you're planning to get answers to from the department would be, you know, why Virginia and why Hampton and the Hampton VA in particular has been targeted for so many cuts, and also if you have a sense of whether these decisions were made in consultation with leadership. Do you have a sense of whose leadership this occurred under and how, you know, the constant turnover of leadership might be impacting why the Hampton VA has received so many cuts, and just sort of curious to get your read on, you know, why Virginia is experiencing this at this point.
There's been no transparency. And, you know, we are demanding, Senator Kaine and I, of the VA Secretary Collins, that we get answers. I've been working on the Hampton VA for literally more than a decade. It had years ago some of the longest wait times of any major VA facility in the country, and we chipped away at it, went through a series of management changes, and got the wait times down a little bit better. But oftentimes the wait times were based upon the lack of providers. We had to do some management improvements, but the idea now that you're singling out Hampton for 700 cuts, where did they come up with that number? What was the basis? 300 cuts in Richmond, 200 in Salem and Southwest Virginia? Where did those numbers come from? Were they pulled out of the air? We've known for a long time that this administration was trying to dramatically cut the VA staff. And there was pushback, bipartisan pushback, and now it appears they're just trying to do it through a back door. And one of the questions we also have got, we spent years opening up, because of the Hampton VA's overcrowdedness, we spent years trying to get another larger facility down on the south side in Chesapeake. It recently opened, but it's not full as well. We don't know how many, and not just Chesapeake, but there's a series of clinics across the south side that are going to hit cuts too. We haven't gotten answers. And what I would strongly urge is that the president received a lot of veterans support. This administration needs to hear from the very men and women who protected our country how angry, how disappointed, and how incompetent this administration's leadership has been towards the VA. And the challenge as well is when you eliminate these jobs, even if they then reverse it, after the effects of Elon Musk and the Doge, and when you've got kind of a war on federal employees, what provider, what medical technologist, X-ray technologist, all of the other ancillary care are really going to want to go work at the VA when you've got this kind of incompetence at the top? So we're demanding those answers. We're going to get those answers. Again, I can't think of a topic that I've been more involved. I say 10 years. It's more like 20 years going back to my time as governor than trying to make sure the Hampton VA doesn't get singled out. To see the kind of, we've made some progress, but then to see it like arbitrarily cut right now, particularly when we can't even get a full description on which positions are being eliminated. It's outrageous. And they'll have, I can promise you this, we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Our next question is from Steve with WHRO.
Hi, Senator, and I'm sorry I didn't catch all of your comments on this up at the top, but I'm going to follow up on the VA. And I think you touched on it a little bit with North Battlefield. Collins told Congress back in January that they weren't up to full staff at that point, even though he had promised that when it opened back in last April. Do we know if they ever got up to full staff at North Battlefield, or if some of those cuts and the open positions include North Battlefield?
I don't.
And is it slowing down the opening of other clinics like Western Branch?
The short answer is it is slowing down the opening of other clinics. We don't have the exact numbers on North Battlefield. I am more familiar with the Spotsylvania issue, where they literally had only gotten about 2/3 of their positions filled. So we spend millions and millions of dollars. It took way too long to build these world-class new facilities. And then we're not even going to staff them. It is a waste of taxpayer money. It is disrespectful to our veterans. And the fact that this administration is trying to hide the facts is outrageous. And Tim Kaine and I are going to get to the bottom of this, come hell or high water, and our veterans deserve better. And again, we all know in Hampton Roads we've got a growing veterans population. I opened my comments at the top about the return of the Ford and the Carrier Strike Group, who are on the longest deployment in modern naval history. One of the concerns I have is that with the toll that's taken on those sailors and their families, how many folks are going to not re-up and become veterans as well? This universe is increasing. If we don't honor our commitment to veterans, particularly from a president who promised so much and has delivered so little, it is, again, it's not beyond disrespectful. And it is also just these clinics, it's taken years to open, many of them. It's just outrageous they're not going to get fully staffed. And that even is in addition to all the comments I just meant about the Hampton VA, where they have been singled out at 700 cuts. I'm not sure there's any other facility around the country that is being cut that much. And it does, at least it raises the question of whether this is political from an administration that has basically shown politics at every turn.
Our next question is from Angela with the Hampton Roads Messenger.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you for hosting this call, and thank you for taking my question.
Yes, ma'am.
The NAACP is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse Virginia's Supreme Court decision to strike down the state's redistricting referendum that Virginians voted for. What are your thoughts on these developments?
Listen, I was horribly disappointed with the Virginia Supreme Court decision, particularly in light of the fact that people in Virginia voted. And to see at the same time states like Louisiana, where they literally started the voting and then stopped it, states like Tennessee, Florida, where their state constitutions prohibit this kind of mid-decade redistricting, and their state Supreme Courts, frankly, just lying down and letting the legislature and the effort to kind of tip the balance in Congress run rampant. And to have all this come on top of a Supreme Court decision that kind of knocked part of the legs out of the Voting Rights Act. There is a clearly in my mind, there is one set of rules for Democrats and a different set of rules for folks who support President Trump. And, remember, Virginia, as I'm sure Angela, but others don't, we've got a very challenged history on race in Virginia. We're one of the last states to have massive resistance well into the 60s, where schools stayed closed. For Virginians of color, frankly, for Virginians who care about a fair and equal society, it's been kind of a gut punch. We'll be anxious to see whether the NAACP's lawsuit is heard by the Supreme Court. I hope the Supreme Court would hear it. But I will comment on this in terms of if they don't, I'm going to try to turn out as many voters as possible. If you want to express your disapproval, we'll have a chance to do that come November.
Our next question is from Audra with Sinclair Broadcast Group.
Thanks so much, Senator. I'm wondering what your thoughts or concerns are about how the White House is handling Cuba. We know the CIA director just got back from Havana, and it was only 2 months ago the president said, seeming to be serious, that he would have the honor, his words, of taking Cuba. What are Americans supposed to expect? Are we in for another Maduro-type raid or another Iran?
Well, again, did you also hear the president recently said he might make Venezuela the 51st state? Is that, it's like, on the one hand, he tries to cut back on Latino immigrants everywhere, and now he's suggesting Venezuela is a 51st state. Where's the plan? Obviously, we see what's happened with the Iran war when there was no plan, and he's gone 0 for 4 on any of his goals, and we're looking at a record energy crisis. In Cuba, we were told that the CIA director Radcliffe was going there. I've not had a briefing yet. That falls into my purview on the Intelligence Committee. I wish we had been briefed ahead of time. I expect to get a briefing and update next week. But we keep sending mixed messages. On one day we want regime change, on the next day we're sending top officials. It would be ironic, as I mentioned earlier, if we end up with Iran back to where we were under President Obama with JCPOA, and we end up with reopening some relations with Cuba, and we're back to where we were with President Obama. Now, he'll have to call it all different, but that could be the outcome. And let me add one other comment. The crisis with the Cuban people is extraordinary. Cuba's going through what, quite honestly, the rest of the world may go through if we run out of oil reserves, which was in Mitchell's first question. So, you know, the United States has offered to bring some humanitarian aid and distribute through the Catholic Church. I wonder whether that was discussed with these meetings. But when you start these paths, you know, you got to have a plan. You got to have a plan. And so far, and as the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, I sure as heck would have hoped that I would have had some idea of what this administration's plan is for Cuba, and I don't.
Our next question is from Tosin with DC News Now.
Hey, Senator. Good morning. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. A couple questions. The first is not necessarily related to Virginia, but in Maryland, their state house is considering entering the redistricting race, and obviously they have to consider what the Supreme Court in Virginia did. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on if Maryland should even venture into this, knowing what happened to Virginia. And my final question is, obviously, we've seen everything that's happened on the Republican side, talking about the states that have been done, and people say Democrats need to move a little differently, sort of like the Republican lawmakers are. What are your thoughts on Democrats taking a different approach to how they get things done, taking maybe some of the approach that some of the Republicans are taking?
Well, there is from many of our Republicans kind of a burn down the house approach. And let's again remind everyone, this only started because Donald Trump demanded that Texas change its laws and rules. And in every state that has been redistricted towards the Republicans, the voters didn't have a single say. It was done by a legislature, oftentimes violating their own state constitutions with no state court appearing to have the gumption to stand up for their own laws. You know, and it has been a bitter taste that it feels like coming out from the Supreme Court to how many states are addressing this. There's one set of rules for Democrats and another set of rules for Republicans. On your question about Maryland, I will only say this. I've been doing this long enough that I am, you know, we have great ways where we partner with Maryland, and we have great ways where we compete with them, particularly on the economic development side. But I'm going to be smart enough to keep my nose out of Maryland politics.
Senator, our next question is from Nick with Falls Church News Press. Nick, are you there?
Hello. Hey, Senator. I just wanted to ask if you are as concerned as you have been recently about the overall impact of Trump efforts to skew the results of the November election. Do you have any updates about that other than obviously what's happened with the referendums and so forth?
Yeah, Nick, I continue to be concerned about the president or people in his administration trying to interfere with the elections this fall. I continue to reach out, for example, to retired intelligence professionals, retired law enforcement, retired military, to ask them whether they will stand up if we see illegal actions, or where I'm particularly concerned, somebody like Director Gabbard coming out with a non-validated piece of intelligence and claiming some foreign interference, and that being used as a justification to bring troops or ICE or other to the polls. I can tell you, that the regular suspects, we finally did get a briefing, Russia, China, Iran, have misinformation and disinformation campaigns planned for this federal elections this year. You will see these come out, I believe, later in the campaign season. And with the powers of AI, this will make what happened in 2016 look like child's play. And we have seen literally at the FBI and the ODNI a complete dismantling of all the election protection efforts that were set up. And remarkably, Nick, most of them were set up during Trump's first term. And, you know, Chris Krebs, the then director of CISA, said safest election in American history, and he got fired for that. But there were good provisions set up. We did get a piece of good news that NSA, the General Rudd, who's a new appointee, is going to stand up the election security unit there. And again, remember, NSA is only looking at foreign interference. They do not do anything domestic. Foreign interference, in the same way that then in 2018, General Paul Nakasone, who had the NSA at that point, was very aggressive about pushing back on Russia. The balance, the ODNI and the FBI, they're going the opposite direction. It does appear that NSA, we're going to monitor this, you know, is moving in the right direction. But we need to be on guard. And again, you don't have to, as you and I have talked about this before, Nick, the other reporters don't have to take my word for it. Look at what the president has said about the fact that Republicans should take over the counting in 15 different locations, and he'll do everything possible to make sure it's a safe election by his terms. This is an administration that has shown, you know, the irony is, you know, I almost fear more from activities and individuals in the administration than in certain ways I fear from the foreign adversaries.
Senator, our final question is from Amy with Virginia Dogwood.
Yes. Okay.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. I know that you and Senator Kaine played an important role in bringing attention and accountability to the Envigo case and helping rescue those dogs a few years ago. Well, down here in the South Side, there are recent concerns surrounding the euthanasia of a dog named Eve at the Danville Humane Society. And I know that Senator Stanley and his staff are actively investigating, but where do you personally draw the line for when elected officials should step in an animal welfare case, and what factors determine whether that type of issue remains at the state level or when it might be appropriate for federal oversight or support?
Well, I'm a strong supporter of you know, animal rights. I mean, I've got a 100% rating, I believe, from the Humane Society, and I was very proud of the fact that we saved those 5,000 beagles, and that some of those beagles ended up on the Puppy Bowl on Super Bowl Sunday. And I've recently introduced additional legislation to try to guarantee safety of dogs, puppies, in some of these testing regimes. Amy, I'm not sure you can draw I don't have an official line of what should just be state versus local versus federal, but I think if there are, you know, the case with the Envigo, they actually crossed state lines because they were doing testing that went beyond. You know, they're a national company that had a branch in Virginia, so clearly there was a federal role. I don't know enough specifically about the case you've got in Southside, but I think people expect elected officials to step up when they hear stories of cruelty or hear stories that you know, seem to go against our basic values and morals as Americans. Now, I know that's a line that is different for various folks, so I'm not going to weigh in on the Southside case, but I'm very proud of what we did for the beagles in the Envigo situation.
And Senator, we do actually have one more question from Kurt Williams.
Hey, Senator, thank you for taking our questions. You mentioned the Ford's homecoming tomorrow, that it's the longest deployment in modern Navy history. What do you want to say, though, to just all of the Navy families here in Hampton Roads that maybe, you know, who are watching this and maybe wondering what this might mean for deployments, the length of deployments going forward?
Well, first of all, I want to welcome the sailors back home, and I know they're all I'm looking forward to them spending some time with their family. I hope in the coming weeks to come down and sit down and hear from those sailors and families directly how the stress of this longest deployment possible, or longest deployment in modern naval history, affected their families. We know the Ford got hit with a fire. We know the Ford got hit with huge plumbing problems. What were the living conditions like? How many of the sailors will not sign up again because of the burden it put on? And you know, this is what happens. You know, the sailors did their job. They will do their duty. They will follow the commander-in-chief. But when the commander-in-chief decides to start a war of choice, as he did with this circumstance in Iran, and not come to the American people and not come to Congress and make a case, and we're now, I think, 79 days into this war, and none of his goals have been accomplished, regime change, nuclear, ballistic missiles, Strait of Hormuz, and I mentioned earlier, we are on the verge of not just $4.50 gas, but if we run through the oil reserves, we'll have a full-fledged financial crisis as well as an energy crisis. I think it's been irresponsible, and I want to hear from the sailors directly. They deserve better, and what adds insult to injury, and I didn't know if you've been on for the whole call, was to have the 320-day deployment of the Ford when there appeared to be no plan in terms of what success was. And then in the same breath, you've got all these cuts at the VA without explanation. You know, this is not the signs of administration that treats its military or its veterans with respect. And these men and women deserve better.
Senator, those were all the questions we had today.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe weekend.